In this new A Bit Lit film, I talked to the wrestler Nick Radford about professional wrestling, but also his identity as the poet laureate of professional wrestling. He's really fascinating on the subject of what it means to be a writer in a wrestling match and in the context of wrestling. And I'm particularly grateful to the way Nick is so open about how he got to that point and why his work matters to him. I hope you enjoy the film. Nick, hey, how are you doing?
Hey, how's it going?
It's going really well, thank you. We're speaking very late for you, very early for me. So I'm grateful to you for staying up to speak to us. And we start these films by asking contributors just to introduce themselves and then to tell us a little bit about what they do. So would you mind doing that, please?
Yeah, of course. And I appreciate you getting up so early to do this with me. My name is Nick Radford. I am known in some circles as the poet laureate of professional wrestling. I am a professional wrestler in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, mainly Washington, Oregon, a little bit up in Canada. I write poetry. Part of what I do when I wrestle is I write and read poetry, often to the chagrin of my opponents. And I'm a member of the Academy with my tag team partner, Tom Allman. And we kind of just bring a bit more of the educational, the literature, those kind of things to the professional wrestling.
Great, thank you. I feel like we should start right there. So what does it mean to be writing and reading poetry in the ring? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that's something that I kind of stumbled backwards into. I never was much of a poet or a writer in my previous life, but I kind of just got some inspiration to really get into the nitty gritty of it. A couple of guys that I train with, the Cook brothers, they're actual brothers. They fight like brothers. They're constantly feuding or yelling at each other, even though they're supposed to be a team and they're brothers. And I would always joke that the sexual tension between them is palpable. And I guess at this point, I should also mention most of my poetry is erotic or at least romantic in nature. I like to call it erotic fan fiction poetry. And I continued that joke. I continued messing with those guys. They're also like honorary members of the Academy, I guess. And I continued that joke with them until the point of like, well, the only logical thing is that I need to write a love poem. And so I tried my hand at it, and it got really good reactions from my peers as well as fans. And I thought this might be something. So I started writing more poetry and introducing it into the ring. And usually what happens is I'll try to read poetry and then I will somehow be interrupted and never actually get to finish my poem on the wrestling show, though I have a couple times. I guess that's part of the charm, is leaving people wanting more, which also sets up for what me reading on my podcast, doing live readings in other venues. I've done comedy shows. I've done like pre-show events, pre-wrestling show events where they would hype up the upcoming show. Yeah, and so it's opened up a new world of wrestling for me. I've never been a fan of wrestling as like the macho thing that most people see it as. I like to see the things that subvert those expectations, play around with the roles, play around with the tough guy personas that we usually think of when we think of professional wrestling.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we're a website devoted to literature and everything else to do with creativity and performance. So you're just the perfect person for us to speak to as someone thinking about a particular kind of performance we're really interested in, professional wrestling, but then putting inside it the world of poetry. So thank you. It's a really great start up for our conversation. I'm really interested in the idea of, I like to talk about and learn about process. So I like to hear about how the idea of the poetry developed from your, basically, if I'm understanding you right, taunting and being mean to these two brothers. So that really interests me. I love the idea that you don't often complete your poems in the ring. So whether that's something that the audience are pleased about, you know, are they supposed to be on your side, or are they meant to be really cross with you for writing poetry and they're pleased you haven't finished? or are you tantalizing them with how the poem's going to end? I'm kind of interested in that as well. Yeah, how the poem actually works within the ring for you and for everyone else.
Yeah. I guess I'll start with the process. Like I said, like it just started from taunting, and it's all good natured. We're all friends. And I never, and the biggest thing for me was I never wanted it to be harmful. I never wanted to present like, I never wanted the butt of the joke to be, oh, these brothers are gay or whatever. Like, that's harmful. I don't want that. That's not cool. I always just wanted it to be, people get uncomfortable when there's sexual tension. People get like giddy, I guess is a good word for it, where like, you know what's going on, you know what's happening. The innuendo is what makes people like uncomfortable, but it's also funny. And I think that's a level of comedy, which is something I draw inspiration from, is comedy in general. But a level of comedy, I think, it comes from that feeling of uncomfortability, putting people in a place where they don't feel normal. And so I think that playing with those sexual expectations does that. A big thing that I want to try to keep in my poetry is I never like get vulgar with it. I never like fully am like, how can I curse on this?
Yeah.
Okay, I never am like talking about like, and then he deep throated his cock, like, and sorry, my cat's gonna be running around in the background.
Just at the perfect time.
But I never want to write like explicit sex scenes, because I think that in doing so releases that tension that I've built up through all the innuendo.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the goal with the poetry. And in the similar vein, when I'm presenting it in the ring, if I'm reading it in the ring, I also am seeking to play with that expectation. I'm seeking to put that level of innuendo, build the anticipation of what's going to happen next. And usually that's what happens when I get cut off, if somebody interrupts me, say with their entrance music, or starts attacking me. That builds that anticipation of wanting to know what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
And often the poetry is used as a tactic to get people to hate me, to get people to be mad. They don't want to see poetry. They came to a wrestling show. They want to see people fight. But, and especially in modern wrestling, within like the last few years, we've seen a lot more people wanting different stuff out of wrestling. We've seen a lot more people, and that's what opens it up to a new audience, right? Like if you just go to a show and it's all just like wrestlers doing the wrestling, that's boring. It's all the same thing. Once you've seen it once, you've seen it a million times. But if it's diverse, if there's different things that draw people in, so like maybe like a circus, if you're not interested in what's happening in a match that's happening right now, maybe the next match will get you. And that's kind of what I lean into. And what I enjoy about wrestling is the diversity of what you can see. You can see something funny. You can see something heartbreaking. You can feel like there's all these different feelings that a show can help bring you out. And I just like to think that I'm another ring in that circus, I guess. And now I lost my train of thought. But yeah, so we're trying to build the anticipation, and nowadays people are more interested in seeing that kind of stuff, the stuff that subverts wrestling. So more recently, I've seen people start to get behind me, start to like want to know what happens next in the poem. And I've been able to play with that as well, where I can be interrupted at the beginning of the match, but once I get the upper hand, well, that's the perfect time for me to continue reading my poem. And people love it or they hate it, but it gets a reaction, and people, no matter what, they're anticipating it. If I'm getting the upper hand and I'm reading my poem and get cut off again, then they're anticipating to hear what's going to happen next. Or if I get the upper hand and I'm reading my poem, people are anticipating, well, who's going to shut them up? So it's all about playing with expectations.
I love it. Thank you. I know you don't need any historical precedent to justify what you do, because what you do is already fabulous. But I just happened this week to be reading about I work on the history of performance in the 16th century, but I'm really interested in performance much more generally in terms of things like combat, fighting, fencing, wrestling. And in the 16th century, there's a tradition of men showing how amazing they are on the battlefield by having archery competitions. But in the middle of the 16th century in the Netherlands, this for some reason develops into poetry competitions. So they're firing their arrows and demonstrating what a brilliant man they are. But at the same time, they're wowing each other with their rhyming couplets.
Wow, I like that a lot.
I love that idea of you in the ring. I mean, it's this is what really fascinates me about wrestling is the playing with the audience's expectations, playing with the rhythms of the match. And if you're kind of setting up these two different rhythms of how the fight is going and at the same time how the poem is going, both you... Just to check, I've understood, Nick. Are you writing the poem at the same time that you're delivering it? Is that the idea?
No, no. The idea is usually. Oh, I wish I was that talented. I usually will write them ahead of time. It's harder if I don't know what my match is going into the show, which happens occasionally. And if that's the case, I'll usually be more general or more broad about what I write about, or more. I've written about like horror movie monsters, like Frankenstein or Jason Voorhees, like whatever suits my fancy. Like if there's something I'm passionate about, I want to put it into my writing. So if I have the opportunity where I don't know like who I'm wrestling or what's going on that show, I'll take that opportunity to write about something different. But I am not talented enough to write the poem during the match. I wish I was.
But are you pretending that you're doing that? Is that something you're...
No, I try to be, I think it's all, it's hard to get like how a fan would interpret it. But the way I'm trying to present it is I have written these, I have a vast, and as I say on my podcast, I try to present the idea that I have a vast library of erotic fan fiction poetry that I dip into and I make a selection and this is what I'm going to read at this moment. When in reality, I'm really pulling that back the curtain now. I'm usually like the night before, like, oh, I got to write a poem. And I'm desperately trying to like figure out like what works, what makes sense for what's happening on the show, but also with who I'm talking about, and then make it all rhyme and make it make sense. And I think I, for the most part, pull that off.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I really like about your podcast is that although you do often refer to your massive, like Prince's vault of music, you talk about your massive vault of poetry, but at the same time, quite often you do also very endearingly say, oh God, I'm nearly running out. I'm really having to write this very quickly to keep up with the podcast. I really like that tension.
Yeah, I try. It's a weird line to walk. Because obviously in any performance, you're turning a dial up to like 11, like you're not presenting who you really are. Like you're taking certain aspects and turning it up. And back in the day, like a few years ago, like 4 years ago or something, I've been wrestling for 7 or 8 years now, I think. So like 4 years ago, I would not have been as open about who I am in reality. I would have presented myself as 100% this person who's completely together. I would have like made people buy into the idea that I do have this vast library. But the way that wrestling has evolved and changed, it's really hard to get those really far out there concepts like that to stick with people and resonate with people, because essentially, and again, pulling back the curtain, now the place that we're in with wrestling is people know we're not actually fighting. People know that that it's a performance. And so when they come to these shows, we are asking them to suspend their disbelief. We are asking them to for a certain level of suspension of disbelief. And there's a point where it's insulting if we're asking for too much. There's like a weird middle ground, because like if you go like really far out there, then people are totally into it. It's totally cool. We've seen that with like a lot of wrestling, especially during the pandemic. Things get really far out there and people dig it. But if you don't go far enough, then it becomes like an eye roll. Like people are like, "We really want you want me to believe this," and then it's insulting to the audience. And that's something that I've always had trouble with wrestling, is that it seems to kind of hate its audience sometimes. It's really big about like dumb stories or dumb character things that like a character taking an action that doesn't make sense for their character. And we're just supposed to like bite it and be like, okay, I guess this is what's happening now. And it seems really insulting. So I try to walk that line of like, and even and this comes maybe almost naturally because of who I am, but even like mid-match, if things aren't going my character's way, if things aren't going my way in the match, I will have a freak out. Like I cannot maintain composure because my character wants to present like he is all together, like he has everything figured out, when in reality, none of us do. So why would it be a believable character if he had everything together? There has to be flaws, and that's one of my character's fatal flaws.
Great. Wow. Thank you. You're talking there about your longer career, and I'm at the mercy of YouTube as to how much of that career I understand. But one thing that really interests me about that career is, and just correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it looks like there's a shift between a kind of an earlier phase where you are the good guy, and wonderfully and hilariously, what a key part of your role is veganism, and I really love that's something that we can maybe talk about as well. And then there seems to be the switch where you become an evil poet. Is that right? And can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. I can give you kind of a timeline because there are like weird phases of my career where I started out. So like I started out in Portland at DOA Pro Wrestling, which is where I was originally trained. I started out as just like a young trainee, like the greenhorn who's just like happy-go-lucky and happy to be there. And I was in this group we called Next Gen, because when I got into wrestling, I had this idea.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. What does greenhorn mean? I'm not familiar with that term.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, if I do that, please let me know. Greenhorn is kind of just like it's the way the wrestling community would refer to just a rookie.
Okay.
So like I'm just a happy-go-lucky rookie, excited to be there. And our group is called Next Gen because when I got into wrestling, I had the idea that I was going to be the video game guy because I thought that's what made me special. I love video games. So I thought that's what made me different. That was what I was passionate about. And then now you look at wrestling, like every single wrestler is like really into gaming. Every single wrestler streams on Twitch. It's not like new or novel anymore. But that's what I thought 7 years ago or whenever. Yeah, it was about 7 years ago. So there's that era. And then once that group kind of split up and we all kind of went our separate ways, I changed things up to be more meme culture-y, I guess. Still like the good guy, still happy-go-lucky. And I got this singlet that had a cat face on it. And people loved it because it's funny. People like cats, obviously. And so I was the cat guy for a while, but there's only so much you can do with that. Like there's not much character development you can do as a cat guy. And so I went that path, and then I was like, I need something different. I need to change it up. And I kind of became this evil hipster character. And I started wearing a scarf, and I started carrying a coffee mug, and I was snooty. And that's kind of like and eventually like all iterations of who Nick Radford is stem from that. That was my first foray into being a bad guy. And that was kind of like what got me to where I am now. And that character kind of had some iterations. Project 42 is a wonderful show, ran out of Seattle. That kind of gave me a lot of creative freedom, but they also had a few ideas of their own. So while playing this hipster character, I was also placed with this like snooty rich kid element, I guess. And it led to one of my favorite moments in my wrestling career, which was once I did like whatever dastardly heel thing I did and people were hating me for it, they just started chanting "Eat the Rich" at me. And it was, if you've never had a room full of people chanting "Eat the Rich" at you, it is a horrifying and beautiful thing. It's gorgeous. And so that eventually kind of like transitioned into the vegan character, which was not real. I have never actually been a vegan, and this is a big deal because one of my closest friends, Ethan HD, is actually a vegan, and I thought it was a funny gimmick for a while, and it is fun. And it's so easy because most of the time when I was doing it, I was doing that character in small town, rural Washington. So like it's all, I don't want to insult anybody, but it's all like blue collar workers, red meat eating Americans. So like they do not like the idea of a vegan. They don't understand the concept. So it was easy, cheap heat, which is when people hate you. I don't know if that term transitions. So I did that for a while, but when Ethan kind of became vegan, I was like, this feels icky that I'm doing this character. But I had already kind of started transitioning that character from what was the vegan to, and essentially I'm just swapping out props this whole time. I swapped a scarf for, I don't even know a cardigan when I was a vegan. I swapped the scarf for the cardigan, and then I added a book, and now we're kind of here. And again, the original idea with the book, I had the book before I started writing poetry, actually, because a friend of mine had mentioned, oh, well, because I always write down stuff and I always like take notes at training and at shows. Like if I see something I like, I know I'm not going to remember it. So I like to write it down. I also keep a notebook on me at all times if I need to make any notes. I just like having physical paper as opposed to like putting it on my phone. And so someone was like, why don't you do that? Why don't you make that your character, the guy who writes stuff down? And so, which doesn't sound like a great idea, but if you expand on it and tweak it a little bit, then yeah. And it's essentially a scholar character all along. And then when the idea to write poetry came around, I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense why I'm carrying the book. Because originally it was just like a textbook, which is fine. And that's how the Academy was formed, was we were both scholars. I was more based on literature. He's more based on the sciences.
How equitable of you.
Yeah, right. And so then, yeah, the poetry just seemed natural and it fit and it made sense.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm writing on paper right now as we're talking. And as you say, it doesn't seem immediately like a super exciting gimmick, but actually it is a really interesting act because it kind of takes you away from the conversation you're having, either privately or in public, like we are on screen now. And I always feel bad when I'm taking notes because I have to look away from you, and my focus is on something that I can see and that you can't. So it does something to the person you're with, and it does something to anyone who's watching as well, I think. And I think there might even be a history of people who write things down, both in the creative arts, like in literature, but also maybe in totalitarian regimes. If you take a pen out and you start writing something down, people notice, and people are like, why are you making a record of this conversation or this moment? So it does kind of interesting things to a live moment of any kind, but particularly I think in a performance. And I'm really interested in the idea that the book comes out with the kind of the vegan character. You mentioned being snooty and having a pot of coffee. I'm British, so I'm already snooty, and I've got a coffee, so I'm halfway there to that role. But yeah, I love that idea that kind of props are leading you in different directions, and the fact that you're bringing a book into the ring starts you writing. That's really exciting.
Yeah, and actually, something I just thought of because you kind of were talking about it. it like creates what you're saying with taking notes. It creates like a break. Like there's like a physical break that happens between you and me.
Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of like what the idea of the character was originally with the book, is like, this is like my shield between me and you people. Which also gets into some weird, and this is kind of the icky stuff I was feeling with the vegan character, is it gets into some weird things that wrestling does, where it villainizes things that are objectively good. Like if you break it all down, being a vegan is not a bad thing. But if you present it in this certain way to this certain crowd, I'm the biggest villain on the show. And similarly with the book, like we're essentially demonizing education. Like people were mad at me because I was educated. And it's weird that also these people were able to immediately, and that's part of like wrestling is being simplistic, but like it's interesting that just having the book, people are able to like pinpoint exactly what I'm doing, pinpoint exactly who this character is, what he's about.
Yeah.
And it was hard to kind of break away from that to become more of like a good guy role. The poetry helps, obviously, because people like it. But it's not something you could introduce organically, I don't think. Like if I were just to debut as the poet laureate of professional wrestling without any other context, I don't know if it would work as well as a good guy, because people, for some reason, wrestling has trained people to automatically be like, books are bad. For some reason, that's a thing that wrestling has gotten down. And we've seen iterations of that evil vegan character too. Daniel Bryan did it recently, like a couple of years ago, around the same time I was doing it. Like shortly after I had kind of started to break away from it, was doing the evil vegan thing. So it's just interesting to note the weird ickiness that wrestling can do of like villainizing good things.
Yeah, and I wonder if, as well as villainizing good things, it sort of brings us back to the beginning of the conversation when you were talking about masculinity and expectations of it. And, you know, all forms of masculinity are jaw-droppingly fragile and silly. And wrestling is complicit in, you know, wrestling is one of the ways in which our culture says things about men and men's bodies and men's emotions and what a man's body should be doing, which is fighting and carrying on fighting no matter what. And then if you come into that space and go, I do not eat cows in a cow eating, in a part of the world which defines masculinity by cow eating, or I write poetry, or I'm hanging out with this book, even though I'm amongst you people, it's troubling masculinity. And you talked earlier, Nick, about the poetry that you write, romanticizing or eroticizing the people around you and the world around you. And I also wonder if simply the act of talking about veganism and talking about books already kind of puts people's identity in a strange place in relation to masculinity and potentially sexuality in a world which thinks in, and again, we're not talking about anyone in your audience here, but just in the culture at large, you know, our culture gets really anxious about any kinds of masculine identity that slip in ways. So you can go quite quickly from, you know, cow eating to poetry writing to other things like sexuality or other kinds of masculine identity, I guess. But there's kind of weird slippages there, and you're playing with all those things all at once.
Yeah, and it's actually really interesting because all these characters are kind of drawn from my experience growing up, because I grew up in like a rural small town in Oregon, and I was taught to dislike people who thought they were better than me or who were X or Y. And so like I always just used that kind of like concept and turned it up to 11. I think that if I were to take the Nick Radford of now, or the Nick Radford or the vegan Nick Radford, or any of those like later year characters, and plop them in front of like 10-year-old Nick Radford, I think I would have hated myself too. Which I think, obviously I've evolved and I've been able to interact with other people and I've been able to understand the nuances of those things. But it's just interesting to see take those personal experiences and turn it on its head, which I think is the biggest, most important thing for us to do with anything in our lives, really, is to challenge it and play with those expectations and play with those tropes, play with the roles to make people uncomfortable, because the more you make people uncomfortable, the more normalizing things become. And obviously that can be taken to an extreme extent and it can be damaging. But I think a little uncomfortability is important. Like vulnerability is another thing that makes people really uncomfortable. And that's another thing I try to do with my platform nowadays, is be vulnerable about things like my mental health. Because I have social anxiety and it can get pretty severe. And I try to be really vocal about that, because I think about like that 10-year-old Nick, if he had seen someone who's a wrestler who's open about their anxiety, maybe he would have latched onto that. And I assume that other people would do the same.
Yeah, thank you. Ditto. A 10-year-old Andy would be really grateful to you for what you're doing. And so is, well, I've just turned 40. I regret talking about my age now. But anyway, 40-year-old Andy is also grateful to you for talking about that, because it's so incredibly important. I'm really interested as well to think, I'm kind of dovetailing back to the beginning of the conversation again, and still thinking about the idea of the poetry. One of the things that is really distinctive about your writing, and you mentioned this right at the start, is that it's opening the door to the potential eroticism of wrestling itself. But as you quite rightly said, and I think it's a real achievement of your writing, it doesn't do that in a judgmental way, and yet it is doing it in a context which can often feel very phobic about all kinds of different sexuality. And as a gay wrestling fan myself, I always wonder a bit about the word homoerotic when we talk about wrestling, because I sort of feel in lots of ways it's just simply erotic, not by default, but it's an art form which invites display, and it invites physical intimacy in ways which, again, our culture usually would never dream either of participating in or of watching publicly. So I really value the kind of free-spirited nature of the poetry, but I wonder if you might tell us a bit about what it means to acknowledge that and to talk about it within a match, because part of me wonders if actually the more you talk about it, the less it becomes true, that it opens a kind of safety valve. I'm not, by the way, I feel like I've just said your poetry is unsexy. I'm not saying that.
No.
But I wonder if by talking about it, by talking about it and acknowledging it, I wonder if it takes it away. I've got no idea. I wonder what it means to talk about these things within a match. That's a big question. I'm sorry.
No, that's an awesome question. And honestly, it's something I hadn't really thought about. So I'm just gonna talk through this, and we're kind of like gonna go through my thought process together.
Great, thank you.
So to start, one of the things that really inspired me to start writing this poetry was an erotic author named Dr. Chuck Tingle. I don't know if you're familiar at all.
No, amazing name.
He got famous writing like very silly parody erotic stories. That like he would usually write about like dinosaurs, concepts. He's very big on like doing like concepts, having intercourse, relationships between like dinosaurs and Bigfoot and like silly stuff like that. Also lots of parodies. So like, and if something got popular, like I was introduced because somebody shared like, when Pokemon Go got big, someone shared like a look at this funny Pokemon Go erotic story. And so I started kind of following him, and he's very, very, very sex positive. And like, it's really important for him to, because his stories are a parody and like, they're funny and silly, but then like they get down to the nitty gritty when it comes time. And that's also part of the humor that, that me as a straight cis man, would find in it at first, was the uncomfortability of like these sex scenes, because mostly he would write cis male. Originally, that was all he wrote. And then eventually, like he started branching out to female, cis female, transgender tales, non-dysphoric transgender tales. So like kind of running the gambit, but he always makes sure especially when he started branching out, to consult with people within those communities to make sure he wasn't being harmful. And that's, and again, like, since I brought it up, like, it, as a straight cis male, it's hard to dip my toe into that, because I do feel like I'm coming into a world, because there are very famous queer wrestlers that are doing really good work to change the perception of what a queer wrestler can be. And I don't want to be the straight man playing gay. I never want to do that, because that's harmful. But I think I try really hard to capture sexuality in general. Like, I'm not trying to, like, oh gosh, this is hard. I'm not trying to gender my poems. Like, I can write about whatever. Like, I don't see it as like X and Y or X and X. Like, I don't see it that way. I just see them, these characters, because, and I think part of being able to achieve that is keeping it just innuendo. Because I feel like if I were to go further, then maybe the joke might become like, oh, it's a gay thing, which, again, I don't want. That's harmful. So I've had this discussion a lot, and I've had these thought processes, but I've gone back and forth about, like, am I doing this right? Am I okay? And I do consult with people in those communities to make sure that I'm not being harmful. And they always reassure me that I'm not. So I'll take that as I can. And if I ever were to be, I would want people to bring it to attention, because I never want that. I want to be able to learn from this. And part of the reason I do it now is because being raised as a cis straight man, sex was super, in a rural community, sex was super taboo. And, like, I didn't learn anything about it. Even like what you would expect from, like, sex ed, like, we didn't learn anything. And so it always made me uncomfortable. It made me uncomfortable for a really long time. Like, I didn't like, this is embarrassing, but I didn't like Game of Thrones because it was too sexy. It made me uncomfortable. And so that was something within myself, I was like, why is this something that's happening? Why does it make me uncomfortable? And that's something that I confronted within myself.
Right.
And I'm fortunate that I've had partners that I've been able to talk about that with and whatnot. And I think my goal is, with the poetry, is to help other people achieve that. Like, obviously, most of the people that I'm writing the poetry for are already there. They understand that sex is silly and goofy and weird, and we can all talk about how weird it is, and how it can make us, like, uncomfortable, but, like, in a good way, which is the goal of the poetry. But I also hope that in doing so, I can maybe I can find, like I said, with the 10-year-old Nick Radford, maybe I can find 18-year-old Nick Radford, 19-year-old Nick Radford out there who does feel, like, weird and uncomfortable about sex a little bit, because like, it was super taboo and I didn't learn anything about it. So that's kind of what the intention is. I feel like I've lost the point a little bit.
No, you're totally on point. It's fantastic. And I think we should say, for any of those, anyone watching this, for whom this is new, there's lots of content on our website to explore around queer and trans issues. But because you mentioned the idea of sex positivity, I will direct listeners to a film we made right at the start of this project, which is hilarious. And actually, if there are any Nick Radford fans and wrestling fans watching this film who would like to learn more about the sex positive medieval period, I strongly direct them to, I think it's film 7 with Eleanor Yarniger, a hilarious film about just how sexy the medieval period was. But yeah, I sometimes feel like I spend a lot of my time making sex deeply unsexy in my work, in the name of trying to make it feel less terrifying and scary. But yeah, it's really important, and the dialogue that you talk about there with particular kinds of communities and the dialogue with yourself, I think really shows up in the work, because it would be so easy for literature in a wrestling ring context to slip into all kinds of positions and judgments, and your work just goes right through that and simply points to sexual and other kinds of possibilities. And I think that's really interesting and exciting, and it's something that I've really valued about your work.
I really appreciate you saying that. That means a lot. And actually, you brought up a memory that I have, because I didn't grow up watching wrestling. I started watching wrestling when I was probably like 13. Like a friend of mine introduced me to it. I grew up thinking wrestling was stupid and never wanting to watch it. But a friend of mine got me into it. And when I got into it, it was around like 2004, probably. It was like when John Cena was becoming big. And let me know if I need to provide any more context to this. But like the thing that made John Cena famous is essentially doing the same thing that I'm doing. Is he would rap. He would do raps, like, but literally the same exact thing. Like his was raps, mine was poetry. That's the only difference, which rap is poetry, especially with the way he was doing it. But he very, very famously, all of his raps were extremely, and this is indicative of the era too in wrestling, they were extremely homophobic, extremely. Again, this era was very much in that way of like homophobic and super, super harmful to women. And so that was indicative of the era, not that it's good, but that's just the era it was. And I look at that, looking at it then, I was like, this is weird. But now I feel pride in being able to be like the polar opposite of that. My goal is to be the polar opposite of that. And it's not John Cena's fault. Obviously they have like a writing team. Obviously, like he's given these lines. But I want to be the opposite of that. I want to be the least harmful, especially in comparison to something like that. Like we can never go back to that. Is my goal for wrestling.
Yeah, and you're right. Poetry and rap are essentially the same thing, but I guess the key difference, going back to masculinity, is that rap is really strongly associated with masculinity and poetry isn't. And I'm trying to think when Eminem became big, I suppose quite a bit before that, but there's also something about race, I presume, with a white guy rapping in 2004. I don't know, but I guess it's playing into all kinds of constructions about what a man looks like and is like. Nick, I think we should draw this to a close, but I'm really sad to say that because I'm loving the conversation. I'm really, really grateful to everything you shared with us. And I don't want to sound grateful to how articulate you've been, because that sounds really patronizing, but I guess what I'm trying to say is you've been very open about what you do, and I really appreciate and value that. And I think so too will lots of people watching this. I'm just going to summarize where we've got to, partly so you can correct me and partly just for the benefit of our audience. But I think just the title of the Poet Laureate of Wrestling is just the best job description of all time, and you must never let that fall off of your resume. I love the idea of writing and reading poems within the ring. I guess I've got that wrong about writing the poem in the ring, but certainly of reading the poem in the ring. And also, I like the idea there are two different fights going on. You're fighting your opponent, and you're also fighting your ability to deliver the poem. And I think that's really exciting and fun. I think the conversation we've had about the erotics of wrestling is really important, and the politics of that as well. I think if I had time, I might ask a follow-up question, but I'm a bit worried it's a massive can of worms we mustn't open. But you've talked about doing this over the last 4 years, so I wonder what that's been like given our current political moment, and who we've had in power, not just in your country, but in mine. But maybe we shouldn't go there. We could always turn the camera off and talk about that if you like. But yeah, I'm interested in what that did to the context of what you were doing.
Well, and you're welcome to cut any of this out. But I am comfortable talking about, like, I hate the word radicalize because it feels like it creates an expectation or something. or it creates like a wall, like you are either on this side or this side. But there's always the meme going around of like, what radicalized you? And it very much, obviously, like I was passionate about things, and I talk about this a little bit because, again, I think it's important to talk about. This is the first year I've ever voted in my life. And that's not something I'm proud of. It was just, I wasn't educated well enough to understand the consequences that the voting system in the United States has. I was educated that one side is good and one side is bad. And I didn't like the one side is good, one side is bad concept. I just went about it in the wrong way. Instead of like trying to figure out who would do the least harm, because as a straight cis white male, I never had to think about those things. Especially growing up in the world that I grew up in. So instead of trying to figure out who did less harm, I just defaulted to, I'm going to sit this one out. And that's an extremely privileged take to have. But obviously, like, especially the last 4 years have really lit a fire under my ass to undo the harm that not only I did by sitting it out, but like undo the harm that people in my family have done by not understanding the struggles of other people, not understanding the consequences of their voting habits. So I think that plays a pretty big role in my poetry and in my wrestling in general. I've talked on social media before, I think, about like my parents really enforced like weird gender roles on me, like you can't have a Furby because that's a girl's toy, stuff like that. Or like you can't watch certain shows because they're girl shows. And I'll always, and this is and it's a little, you can tell me if this is a harmful joke. But I'll always joke like, well, joke's on them, because now I play fight in my underwear with other guys. Like if you're really trying to, like, I just went the opposite direction. I fought against it. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is fight against those things that were instilled in me so that other people don't have to have those instilled in them, so that people can understand the importance of all the things that we've talked about today, and a ton of other things that I didn't understand when I was an 18-year-old straight cis white male. So that's my goal, is to use those privileges to try to fight against the harm that my parents' privilege has done. I try to use my privilege to undo their privilege.
Yeah, thank you. That's really fascinating. And I guess that idea of one side is good and one side is bad, that speaks both to the political moment we're living through, but also wrestling as a genre often both plays, has that and also plays against it in lots of interesting ways. So that's really fascinating. Yeah, Nick, I've learned so much. Thank you very, very much. I'm just looking through my notes to think if there's anything else I should make sure we talk about, but I think we've underlined everything that you've brought up in the film. I really value having this conversation, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I've had a blast.
Good.